Hi everyone, this is Erin Ryan from Color Fun Quilts, and today we're going to talk about machine binding curved corners, just like we see in this Cozy Curves quilt. We'll start by making our binding by sewing together our seams on the diagonal, and then we'll attach it to the quilt. Okay, so I have a pile of 2.5 inch strips of fabric here that I'm going to turn into binding. So this is how I attach them on the diagonal to help avoid thick seams. So this fabric doesn't have a right and a wrong side, but if it did, I would put right side up for this bottom piece, which I'm going to lay horizontally across my sewing table, and then I would put the next piece right sides together, so right side facing down on top, coming out vertically from my needle. So now I have both of these pieces lined up corner to corner. And what I'm going to do is angle and sew from the corner of this top piece to the corner of this bottom piece. If it's helpful to draw a line, you certainly can do that so you see exactly where you're going. Okay, and then I'm not going to cut my thread, but I'm going to take this piece that was on top. I'm going to flip it over so that it's right sides up. It's going to be my next horizontal piece. And then I will take another piece, match up the ends, place them right sides together, and sew corner to corner. Again, I'll take this top piece, flip it so that it's right sides up, get another piece, right sides together, and sew corner to corner. If it's helpful, you can pin your pieces together and then know that you're going to sew diagonally between them. And I'm just going to repeat this process until all of my strips are sewn together. Okay, this is my last strip. So I'm going to cut my thread, and you can see all of my strips now are attached like so. So what I'm going to do is clip my thread, and then I'm also going to go through on this triangle here and trim a 1/4 inch. You could measure and use a rotary cutter and stuff, but I just keep scissors nearby. So clip and trim. And then what I'll do is take this over to my iron. I'll press all of these seams open and then press my binding in half and roll it up so that it's ready to attach to my quilt top. Okay, so for this quilt top, I am working with rounded corners, and I have already rounded all 4 of my corners on this quilt. Now this is the Cozy Curves pattern. It's one of my patterns that just released in February, and in the pattern you're working with curved templates. So one of the templates that comes with the pattern is the exact shape that you need for these rounded corners in particular, but you can round your corners with anything. A plate makes a really great template. You could of course cut out your own, the base of a trash can or a basket or anything round. The wider the base, if you can imagine this is a 1/4 circle, so the wider the base, the wider your curve is going to be, the skinnier your circle is, the tighter of a rounded corner that's going to look like. So all I did on this quilt is line this up and take my rotary cutter and trim off my excess, and that leaves me with this nice rounded curve. So I have done that on all 4 of my corners here, and I'm going to attach my binding just like I would normally in my machine binding. So I have my binding strips all sewn together, pressed. All of my seams are pressed open before folded in half and pressed together for double fold binding. And I roll it onto an extra spool, an extra thread spool, and then that way I can pop this onto either an extra thread pin on my machine or even my bobbin winding pin, and then it can just unravel as I need it, which is really handy, keeps things organized. I can also stick a pin in this and just have my binding ready and waiting until it's time to actually bind my quilt. But we're gonna jump into it now. So I have all my corners rounded, and I'm really not gonna do anything different. I'm still going to start by attaching to the back, and then I'll fold over and flip to the front. Okay, so I'm ready to get started. I have my binding here all rolled up on the spool, and I'm going to stick it onto my bobbin winder up here and just have that ready to go as I need it. I have my label. That's number one thing you need to not forget before you start your binding. I'm working with my walking foot on my machine. Highly recommend walking feet for binding, machine binding in particular. It just makes everything a whole lot easier. You're going through a lot of layers, and this will help keep things really even. And then I'm just going to attach this on my normal stitch settings, about 2.5 millimeters for the back of the quilt. And then I have my quilts here ready to go. So I do not have any particular reasoning for starting and stopping your binding in a certain spot, but I tend to start by attaching my binding just around the edge from the first corner, so that by the time I get all the way around and I'm rounding my last corner, I'm almost done. It makes me feel better, like I'm getting close. So the first thing I'm going to do is line up my binding. I always leave an extra tail of about 6 to 8 inches before I actually start my stitching. And then I'm going to move my needle position so that if I align with the edge of my walking foot here, my binding edge and my quilt back edge, I get a 1/4 inch. So that's a setting on your machine that you will have to mess with. Okay, and then I am going to start by back stitching. And then this is how I'm going to continue to work until I get to a corner. So I'm coming to the point where I'm rounding my first corner here. And like I mentioned earlier, I'm not really going to change how I attach this binding. I'm just going to slowly work it around the curve and keep my 1/4 inch. So you can see here, this is what that first curved edge looks like. So my binding will look a little bit wavy here. When we flip that over to the front side, it will all come together nicely. But for now, perfectly okay that that's a little wavy. And you can see my 1/4 inch. Obviously it gets a little bit skinny here, but it's gonna be perfectly fine And I'll just continue to do that on all 4 corners. Okay, so again, I'm coming up on another corner. The nice thing about this rounded corner method is you can see here I have a diagonal join in my binding that I have again pressed open and then pressed in half. And it doesn't matter that my join is on my curve. It would matter if I were doing a mitered corner because the bulk would be too much for the fold. So here's that curve that I just finished. Again, working right along with that 1/4 inch. And see, here's my seam, and it's not going to matter at all. Okay, so I have rounded my last corner. I'm going to backstitch and cut my thread, and I'm about 6 inches away, 5 or 6 inches away from where I had left off here. So the first thing I'm going to do is cut the tail of the rest of my binding about halfway down this gap between my piece that I started with and the piece that I just ended with. And then what I'll do is cut just a little piece. This will be my measurement, 2.5. And I will lay the underside flat, the top side, which is the piece that I left at the beginning, over it. And then I'm going to use this little bit as a measurement. So I'm going to line it up here with this bottom piece and then lay the other one on top and clip it at the top of this 2.5 inch mark. Now you could just get out a ruler and measure, but this always works really well for me. So now I know that these 2 pieces overlap by exactly 2.5 inches. Okay. So what I'm going to do now is join these on the diagonal, and I'm going to start by opening the bottom half so that it is right sides up, and then I'm going to open the bottom half and right sides together. I'm going to match my corners here. And I'll stick a pin in that. Okay, so I have from the top piece, I've opened up my fold and it's right sides up. From this bottom piece, opened up my fold, right sides up, and I'm pairing them together across this top edge and then down the side edge. If you feel like you need a little bit more space to work with, you can absolutely, unpick some stitches or just give yourself more room in the beginning. This can certainly be a little bit tricky as you're starting out. Okay, so now that I have these pieces together, I'm going to stitch on the diagonal from this corner down to where this corner meets. And I'm going to fold my quilt in half here so that I can get it all underneath my needle. And I will also backstitch at the beginning and end here. And just make sure my pieces are laying flat Take out my pins. Okay, so I now have this diagonal join with my extra little tail flaps, but before I cut those, I'm gonna just make sure that when I sort of fold this back together, it really does line up where I need it to. If it's too big or too small, you'll unpick that distance and re-sew it. So this looks good, so I'm gonna cut this at a 1/4 inch, just like I did with all of my other binding strips when I was attaching them. And then you could take this to the ironing board and press it open, but I'm just gonna finger press and then fold this binding back together. And then all I'll do is line it up under my machine again. Start and stop with a back stitch. All right, so there we go. My binding is all attached. And so now what I'm gonna do is flip my quilt over and start attaching to the other side. Okay, so I'm flipping my quilt over. And again, I like to start near a corner just for my own sanity. And a couple of tricks that you can do if you are having trouble with this fold over as you go technique. Firstly, you could iron all of your binding out from the back so that it's easier and crisper when you fold it onto the front. You could of course go through and attach binding clips or pins. You could also glue based. I've seen people do a small thread of washable Elmer's glue here, fold your binding over, and then iron that glue dry, and that way your binding is in place as you go through. I like to just fold as I go to save time on all of those steps, but if you are struggling with consistency here, that is a great option. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm actually going to pull up my bobbin thread. And the reason that I do this is so that I can avoid a nest on the back side of my quilt where I start and stop the top stitching on the front binding here. So I'm just going to let those tails hang, and what I'm not going to back stitch when I start stitching here. Okay, so I'm going to get this up underneath, and what I like to do is align my needle setting so that I can fold and have this binding run right through the middle of my walking foot, of the toe of my walking foot. So I can always have a visual alignment of where this binding should be meeting up, and I know that my needle will be right there catching the very edge. So for me on this Janome, that's a width of 5, and I'm going to keep my stitch length the same. Okay, so you'll notice I did not backstitch when I started. I am feeding my binding through, folding as I go, and feeding it right through the middle of the toe of my walking foot. So I'll do a few inches at a time before I need to shift my quilt and fold another chunk. So you can see here, that's what the edge looks like. I have my needle catching just along that edge, and then on the back side, my stitching line is following along the edge here. Now, if you want your stitch line closer, you could attach your binding a little bit thicker or cut a thinner binding all together. I cut 2.5 just so I have room, but you could of course maybe cut your binding at 2 1/4, or like I said, attach with a thicker seam allowance instead of a 1/4 inch, maybe go up to 3/8 inch. Okay, so I'm going to continue this process all the way around until I get to a corner, and I'll show you how I maneuver that. So I'm coming up on my first corner. So the first thing I'm going to do is flip my edge over along the whole corner. And then I'm going to, from the center, press it down and just sort of roll the binding over the edge. Nice and slow, feeding it through my machine. Roll the binding over the edge so it's nice and flat. As I mentioned before, you can of course lift your presser foot to help with that curve. Okay, so at this point I've made it around my first corner, and I'm going to keep going to the next one. Okay, so here's a close-up so you can see that I'm feeding right through the center. Okay, so again, I'm coming up on a curve, so I'm going to flip my binding over to the front around the whole curve as my first step. I'm going to continue to feed right where I have been. I'm just going to sort of roll the edge of my binding so that it's even all the way around. Again, you could clip or pin. Okay. Really, you're just trying to avoid puckers. Like I said, on this wide of a curve, you really shouldn't have a problem there. And then here I'm coming up on my label, which I just sewed into the back side. So I'm going to leave it where it is and just continue to finish my binding and stitch it down. So here's that curve that I just did. You can see right here is where I have a seam join. Did not impact how I stitched this on. Nice smooth curve all the way around, and then there is the back side. My thread tails here from where I started, so I'm just gonna make sure those are not knotted up in the back. And then I will stitch slightly past and back stitch where I had started. Cut my thread. And then I will just snip my thread tails on the front and on the back. And I just think it leaves a nicer little start and stop without a thick nest, if you will. Now I chose to just use a silvery thread. I like the connecting thread silver color, which is sort of a light gray. It's the same thread that I used for the quilting on this, so I use it on my binding too, since I know for sure it'll match along the back side here. You could of course choose a matching top thread for your binding if you don't like the look that the contrasting thread gives. All right, so here's a close-up look at the binding that we just finished. We have all four of our rounded corners here. And there's the back side of our stitching. Now, I'm not perfect and consistent with my stitches, so the spacing here between the binding on the back side will vary from time to time, but I'm okay with it. I think it's all part of the handmade process. Part of the reason I love machine binding so much is because it is way faster than hand tacking your binding. Here's that quilt label. And I think it's a nice strong stitch. So that's it. There's our rounded corner binding. Easy peasy.